Steve Taylor. It says
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right. No more business, no new business today.
I am, David.
All right, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. As has been said, our speaker is Timothy Shepard, Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2022. He has served as a missionary in Morocco, and he has also been an entrepreneur working in web design. He'll have to tell you more about that because I didn't understand it well enough to give you more details. He is now an activist for LGBTQ issues and concerns. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you, Muleskinners, David, Scott, Kathy, Pam. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today and to see a thriving Democratic club. I know you guys all organize, and this is how democracy functions. So thank you so much for your belief in our democracy. And it's so nice to see a group. I can't wait for June 6th. I'm gonna go ahead and put my contact information into the chat here for you all to be able to follow on social media, donate if you want to, subscribe to the newsletter that's going out, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. And I'll give you now a little preview of the stump speech. I look forward to it. So Missouri has new license plates in 2021. We're celebrating our bicentennial. And it's when I got my new plate, it reminded me of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was federal legislation that admitted Missouri into the Union. It was a compromise that was made to prohibit the Northern abolitionists' attempt from preventing the expansion of slavery in the United States. It's really important to me in this campaign and throughout all of 2021, really, to lodge the term Missouri Compromise into people's minds and their thoughts. And I should note that I'm very, very proud to be a Missourian. So I'm framing our conversation around the Missouri Compromise because in my campaign for the US Senate, we're declaring to the world that we are a Missouri uncompromised. And now I'm sure a lot of folks here know people who don't have access. It's been in a lot of topics lately, folks who don't have access to health care. We're fighting hard for it with Medicaid expansion, and I'm really hoping that the court battle that we're undertaking right now is going to help make sure that we extend who has access to health care. On this call, we're all on Zoom, so I'm assuming we all have reliable broadband connections, but we all know that too many people in our state don't have access to reliable high-speed internet. We saw with the McCloskey's announcement recently, and we've seen with a lot of Republicans in this country, just an abysmal embrace of autocracy. And I think most of us, if not all of us here in this room, are very much in agreement that the attack on the nation's capital on January 6th is completely unacceptable, and that this slow slide that we've been having in Missouri and nationally toward autocracy is something that poses a very real threat to our democracy and to our way of life. And I think that's something that we as Democrats are fighting hard for right now. And a lot of Republicans, lifelong Republicans, are looking at their party and not sure what's happened to it. The world is changing really fast, and folks like us are in jeopardy of being left behind. There's a rising China. Power is being concentrated by very, very powerful American monopolies and oligopolies that are forcing small mom and pop businesses out of a livelihood and really threatening workers from being able to have access to living wages. And so I'm running to represent a Missouri that's not going to compromise on healthcare. I'm running to be a senator from Missouri who won't compromise on investing in our education. I think that we need to use the Department of Education to help equalize funding formulas for states where there's rich school districts and poor school districts. And there shouldn't be any school districts that have holes in the gymnasiums or who can't afford to keep the lights on for 5 days a week, or who are struggling to pay teachers a competitive wage to make sure that every single student in Missouri is getting access to the education they deserve. I'm fighting to be a senator from Missouri who won't compromise on democracy, who won't compromise on some common sense gun safety reforms. I and my family, we own guns. We're not out to take anyone's guns, but we need some common sense reforms to prevent the slaughter that happens on a daily basis here in the United States. And I don't think we talk about it often enough with a lot of the monopolistic forces at play in rural Missouri. Gun violence doesn't just impact people in the cities, it impacts farmers. There's a very high suicide rate amongst farmers. And that's a layer that we don't talk about often enough in the equation. And so in my campaign platform, we aim to restore our democracy. We want to rebuild the economy, and we want to invest in the future for America. And it's with organizations like the Muleskinners, and with your volunteering, with your donations, you have the link to the Act Blue, and with your hard work registering 100 to 200,000 new voters in this state in 2022, that we're going to be able to get the 144 votes per precinct that we need on average, additional votes, I should say, on average, in order for us to win. And my campaign is here to help you guys. We have some precinct software that we're working on, and that'll help you and with your field organizers, regardless, I fully intend to win the primary, but regardless of who wins the primary, please, 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 the battle to register voters begins now, and we need your help. Very recently, we have seen the erosion of our little d democratic institutions here in the United States. And we're fighting to make sure that we restore democracy and that we don't compromise on our inalienable rights to free speech, nor our right to vote, nor equality for every single Missourian and every single American. Our kids, our grandkids, our nieces and nephews deserve to inherit a world where America is prosperous and where we continue to lead the world in innovation and create new wealth and new jobs. And that's why we need to invest in the Green New Deal and in infrastructure to ensure that those jobs are created right here in the United States, and especially right here in Missouri. Because otherwise China's just going to run away with it, and we can't have that happen. So I'm Tim Shepard. I'm really happy to be here with you today. And I know that as Missourians that we believe in a diverse, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-abled, multi-generational, multi-gendered, and multi-oriented society, and that together we hold these truths to be self-evident, that each of us is created equal. That is a traditional American value. They don't own that term. And that we all deserve to be represented in the United States Senate. And so together we're fighting to send a new United States Senator in 2022 to Washington, D.C. to declare to the world that the federal legislation passed in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, is over, and that we are a Missouri uncompromised. And with that, I will open it up to questions. That's a little bit of my stump speech. I'm happy to answer any questions about my past. I've done a lot of activism work. And Pam, I see a question. Hi.
Step 2, tell us where you were born and grew up. And another thing, this is a state thing, but would you explain the school foundation formula, what it is now?
I don't know all of the details about the school foundation formula right now, but I know that it's primarily predicated on local property taxes. And so what you end up with is in wealthy school districts, you know, like where I live in the Northland in Kansas City, you've got Clay County and Platte County, and you have higher incomes in those areas, and they're able to vote their property taxes up and make sure that their schools get funded properly.
Okay.
But in, like, say in the urban core in Kansas City east of Troost, or in rural districts like in the 8th congressional district, where it's the 10th poorest district in the country, they just don't have the means to do that. And so there's literally schools in rural counties and urban counties alike in Missouri where they have holes in the gymnasium roofs. They are making decisions as school districts to close for 1 day per week in order to keep the lights on. We have a quote problem, a crisis coming up where there's going to be a teacher shortage. There's no teacher shortage. We're not paying teachers enough. And we used to take pride in our education system here in the state, but over the last few years, I know just recently they cut $300 or $400 million out of the budget for higher education. That's a race to the bottom. We don't grow our economy by cutting education. We grow our economy by investing in education, and that has to include pre-K. That has to include after-school programs for especially for single-parent households. And that needs to include a better federal assistance to rural and urban districts alike to make sure that they have equal footing to the really wealthy areas, because we end up with a disparity in who has access to education whenever it's all up to local funding, because rich people all migrate and live with each other, and you know, poor people end up sort of left behind. And that's just not okay. And that's where the federal government has a role to play in helping to equalize who has access. And so that's a little bit on where my approach is on enhancing the funding formula for states, and as well as Missouri. I grew up in Kearney, Missouri, which is the birthplace of Jesse James. And I grew up very religious. We went to church in the town over at First Assembly of God, and it was in Excelsior Springs. And so a lot of my childhood actually took place in Excelsior, which a lot of people might know from Harry Truman when he stayed the night at the Elms Hotel there. If you guys are looking for a weekend getaway, it is a beautiful town and in a beautiful little valley. There's a winery, there's a little brewery, and the Elms Hotel is absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it.
Well, also, what was your major in college?
Yes, so I'll tell a little bit more about my bio. I always wanted to be an architect. So I went to Boston to study architecture at a school called Boston Architectural College. If you're familiar with the city, it's in a part of the city across from a much more famous institution, across the Charles from MIT, right there in Back Bay. And that was a fantastic opportunity. 2 years into that, the first economic collapse of the millennial generation happened, and architecture got decimated. I was working full-time at a firm. They laid me off, and that's when I decided to take an opportunity from a foreign exchange trip I had taken with my church, and I went to Morocco for 6 months. And I was in the process of becoming a missionary with an organization, and on a fundraising trip actually back home in Kansas City, I came out and I identified myself. I was fully compliant with their rules, but I identified myself as LGBTQ, and they fired me. And so that's when I became an activist for LGBTQ rights. And I got involved, especially in the church, in the evangelical church, really fighting for acceptance and for people to respect each other's differences and to be able to interpret scripture differently than each other. And that didn't pay the bills, so I became an entrepreneur. via the Kauffman Foundation, one of their community outreach programs. And that led me to work in venture capital in Chicago. And it was, while I was there, I did actually mostly nonprofit work. And then I launched my own business at the end of my design. It was structured as a residency with a venture capital firm. I launched my own business. And so I got a really good taste of what it's like to operate a small business in this country. It's very, very hard. I didn't have a very diversified client list. I had one major client and then a few minor ones. And the major client was an insurance brokerage. They dissolved their partnership because they had a disagreement with each other. And therefore my major client went away. And so my small business ran out of money and I did not have a long enough runway to withstand that. So I was really on the edges, falling through the cracks, lost everything, had to live with my partner at the time's parents. And then I went to New York City and couch surfed through a series of job interviews in an attempt to try and figure out how to get a normal career. 6 months of that went by. I was about to throw in the towel and give up completely, move back home, do valet at the hotel again, or deliver pizzas again, or whatever I needed to do. And I got hired by an asset management firm that was headquartered in New York City. So that was really my second big break career-wise. And that's where I learned really how to move activism levers in a new way. They sent me to training as a promising up and coming exec. They were grooming me for senior leadership, and they taught me how activists within the private sector lobbied our employers to make marriage equality happen in the United States by lobbying our employers to write amicus brief letters to state legislatures as well as the Supreme Court. I got to leverage that and put that to use when they moved their headquarters to Tennessee. And the Tennessee legislature, quite a lot like the Missouri legislature this year, had 7 very discriminatory bills against LGBTQ people. I wasn't thrilled about that as a new person to the state and as somebody who had been fired from my job for identifying as LGBTQ. And so I, as the chair of the LGBTQ employee resource group at my firm, lobbied the senior leaders to do something about it. And they did. They wrote a letter to the state legislature. They were the first major corporation in the state's history to do something like that on behalf of a social issue, on behalf of their LGBTQ employees. And it made a difference. Every other major corporation in the state joined us, and not a single one of those discriminatory bills even made it out of committee that session. And so that's where I really got interested in public service and really interested in the legislative process and really interested in being able to use the platform that my employer at the time had given me in order to make good in the world. And that was exciting. Then I learned all about the for-profit prison industrial complex, and it's really bad. I don't know how much everybody knows about it, but we have 3 times more incarcerated people in the United States than any other rich country on earth. And if you really dig into it even more, you'll find that many of the people are in there for non-violent drug offenses like marijuana, or not trafficking drugs, but just consuming them. And that a lot of them are actually working cotton fields. Yes. Cotton fields here in the United States. And that educational process was very difficult for me. And so I became involved in leading the divestment effort from for-profit prisons at the asset management firm where I worked. They have a $650 billion portfolio. And I put a lot of skin in the game, you could say, in leading the effort to get out of that business. That worked, but I paid a price. And so they no longer trade for-profit prisons at all in their $650 billion portfolio. I'm very proud to say. And it was there where I kind of had to really grapple with the conflicts of interest in, do I have a platform to work in the private sector and do this kind of work? Or do I need to get fully invested into public service? And so that was really the moment where I decided to run for public office. And my husband and I decided that we wanted to come back home to Missouri, because Missouri is where I have the most skin in the game. Because like I said, we're fighting for a Missouri uncompromised. And that's really about the debate that we've been having in the United States since we were founded as a nation. And are we going to be a country where the privileged few can profit off of the suffering and human exploitation of the not privileged? Or are we going to be a nation that lives into our national creed, which is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all of us are created equal? I'm fighting for that vision of America. That's the debate that is the undercurrent of every major issue we're having in this country right now, whether it's whether or not Americans deserve access to healthcare, whether or not Americans deserve a great education or not, whether or not working class Americans deserve a living wage. Same debate, different era. And so we're fighting really hard for the vision of America that's really what makes us great. Like that tension built into the Declaration of Independence for each of us is created equal. And that's our legacy to carry forward. And that's what we're fighting for in this campaign. David.
Yeah, I was going to say, we've got a question in the chat from David Robinson. Says, what is your understanding of Senate rules? Do we need them, or are they responsible for the corruption of our government? To address that.
I don't know all of the Senate rules, but if you're alluding to the filibuster, I think we need to get rid of it. And I think it has been a device that has been used very, very wrongly by a minority of the population in order to prevent good legislation from moving forward. To get deeper into what's responsible for the corruption of our government, I'm a huge, huge advocate of passing the For the People Act. That goes a really long way towards getting transparency into campaign finance, and gets into fixing a lot of who has access to the polls, but it doesn't go far enough. So it's really popular as Democrats for us to rail against corporations in this country and their ill influence on elections. But and that is somewhat true, but that's an abstracted truth. The real problem and where the corruption comes from in our country, ever since Citizens United passed, is where you have super PACs and 501c4s. And I don't know how many of you guys realize they can raise as much money as they want from as few people as they want. And they can spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections. And so corporations are a problem. We've got to deal with them. We need antitrust law. We need to help strengthen the economy. But where the corruption comes from is where I have a call time list, you guys, that includes the richest people in this country. They give north of $100 million every single 2 years, individuals and families. And it's wrong. It's very, very wrong, because there might be a friends of group supporting me or any other candidate, for example, on either side of the aisle. And it doesn't matter how much the campaign raises. It doesn't matter the rules that exist for us. We have $2,900 contribution limits. That's great. But when you dig below the surface, the source of corruption is from 501c4s and super PACs, and it's from 30,000 families in the United States who have the means, that's the top 10th of the top 1%, who have the means to give more than $100 million per cycle, and they do. And we're never going to fix corruption in this country until we end that practice. And just talking about corporate money is it's not good enough. It's not addressing the problem. because corporations have spending caps on how much they can give publicly. And where the money really comes from is from the shareholders, the independent individual shareholders of corporations who are extremely, extremely wealthy.
I have a
He has his hand up.
I have
Sue
a
and
quick
Herb, yeah.
technical question. When you put in the chat earlier, subscribe to the newsletter, I clicked on that real quick, saw looks like the latest version of your newsletter, but it didn't see where to subscribe. Is that somewhere in the newsletter?
Yeah, if you click on that link on a desktop browser, it should be on the
Yeah.
top left.
Okay. Now all it shows is hi, first name in this edition of the Shepard Post, but I don't see anywhere to subscribe to it.
In that case, go to tshepard.com. I'll look into fixing that link. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, that's what I see. Okay.
And then on if you go to my website,
Yeah.
there's a subscribe link about halfway down the page, and you can put in your first name, mobile number, email address, and zip code, and that'll get you signed up.
There it
And
is. Okay, I see it. And you've got that. You have your website in the chat. Thank you.
And Sue and Herb, yes. Herb, you're muted.
All right. A spate of bills, a cacophony of bills and advocating voices are piling up on the doorstep of the US Senate, passed by the House or about to be passed. Enough of these to create difficult strategic choices for Senate leadership.
Yeah.
Are you prepared to defer to Majority Leader Schumer and the current Democratic caucus to choose which ones to push first, or do you have such strong feelings about one or another that you would want to push for making it first or second or whatever?
So my strongest feelings derive from the biggest crises that face us, that I consider like if we don't fix them, nothing else matters. And that is number one, saving democracy in the United States. We have to stop the slide to autocracy. If we don't do that, if we slide into autocracy, then that whole debate that I framed around the debate that we've had since the beginning of the United States of America, then we're just another China. And that might be something some people are okay with. I'm not. So that's a big one, and that gets into the campaign finance reform. And then the second big issue, and this isn't to scare people, but if we don't address climate change, we're looking at a mass extinction event, period, in our lifetime. Well, in my lifetime, in my daughter's lifetime. And we have to fix that. It's an opportunity for us to lead the world. It's an opportunity to create new wealth. We have enough time to fix it. And if we don't fix it, then in my lifetime or in my daughter's lifetime, it's not pretty, and we have to address that. It is not something that we can continue to kick the can down the road. Time is up. And I'd rather preventative invest in creating new wealth and prevent that from happening than in my daughter's lifetime. We're dealing with multiple billions of migrants. We're dealing with food supply breakdown in the Atlantic Ocean. It's not pretty. It's really not pretty. We have to prevent that.
To clarify, these take precedence over, in your mind, should be coming first before we address the president's initiative regarding infrastructure and Science Plus. Is that correct?
Ideally, I'm not going to prevent those things from happening, but I'm going to make a lot of noise about it. And I think that the president's infrastructure initiative it's a step forward. It's a step in the right direction towards solving climate. He has a lot of good stuff in there, but it has to be more. I won't prevent that from happening since there's already momentum, but we have to, in the 2022 session, we have to start immediately really we need to start now. I don't have the power to do that yet. But we have to solve climate change. The infrastructure package is a really good first step. It's the first major legislation that we've had in a long time where there's actually been funding to deal with some of these things, but we have to go further. Does that answer your question?
I think you've voiced your views.
Tim, how will you deal with the other senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley?
Well, he doesn't do much, quite frankly, for Missouri. He's really bad at his job. I don't know how he gets away with it because he doesn't do much other than make noise in the press and social media. In dealing with him, where there is opportunity to deal with him, if he's serious about antitrust, then we could be partners in that, and getting some collaboration. But I would work with him on that. I would still also like to censure him, and I would like to sponsor a committee to look into who was actively complicit in leading the insurrection on January 6th. I think that we have experienced a moment in history that is not unlike what happened in Germany when Hitler tried to stage a Bavarian government takeover, and 10 years later came back as chancellor. And we need to hold the leaders who are responsible for that accountable. There have to be consequences, or we're just allowing would-be autocrats to continue their plot, and there is a plot to turn the United States into an autocracy. Yes.
We sent a letter to the court to ask that he be disbarred.
Yeah, he needs to be disbarred. He needs to not be a senator anymore. I think we're going to have to do that through the electoral process in all likelihood. But I would use any lever or tool available. I would use it to hold him accountable. I would encourage district attorneys in multiple jurisdictions to look into crimes. Yes, Carl and Marie.
Mari, thank you. My question has to do with, I appreciate and agree with your observations about climate change being an existential crisis that we're facing. I would like to hear more about what you think are the top priorities in dealing with that.
Well, the easiest way, I don't know how much everybody here knows about carbon versus methane, but a really faster way of preventing the issue would be by addressing methane emissions, because the half-life of methane is much shorter than the half-life of carbon. And so we have a real opportunity to get a quick shot in the arm and prevent the crises from happening by figuring out and working with experts to be able to cut methane emissions down. Then there's a concept called embodied carbon. We're releasing an article about that here pretty soon. And that gets into supply chain management. There's about 100 million extra people that are going to be in the United States by 2050, which is 100 million extra people that we have a lot of infrastructure to build for. And one of the largest contributing factors to greenhouse gas emissions is actually concrete and the process of building concrete. It's very, very carbon intensive. And so there's new recipes for concrete that are 80% more carbon efficient than traditional recipes. And we need to make sure that those achieve industrial scale as we're building out new infrastructure. We need to look at, in Missouri, 80% of our energy comes from coal. We think it's cheap because the bill is cheap right now, but if 80% of our energy is coming from coal and the carbon output from that is a major contributing factor in existential crises, then we have to figure out a way to deal with that. In northern Missouri, we have a phenomenal wind output capacity, we've got solar capacity, and we've got new battery technology. And I think that we can invest through the Department of Education in grants to WashU and grants to Mizzou in order to continue to build on that technology, make sure that research is happening in Missouri. And then manufacturing, there's new union jobs. Like, this doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. It's a dire circumstance, but there's huge economic output that comes on the backside of this. And our history here in the United States, what built the greatest middle class the world has ever seen in the middle 20th century was massive investment in the space race. It was massive investment post World War II and all of the technology that came out of DARPA. Like, when we all organize ourselves together and we invest in solving major challenges, it doesn't just prevent the doom and gloom, it creates like an incredible new economy where we get to lead the world. David.
Yeah, speaking of leading the world, I see another question in the chat from David Robinson. It says, besides the challenge of China and climate change, which you've already mentioned, what are the most pressing foreign policy issues you see today?
Well, I think Russia's a major problem. I don't know how many people saw a few weeks ago that they're building new military installations up towards the North Pole. That is so that they can more readily reach the United States. And they're also doing a lot of geopolitical maneuvering in Ukraine, and they're trying to reassemble their empire. Unfortunately, the Trump administration left an enormous vacuum of power for both China and Russia to fill. And they filled it. And we have a lot of work to do to rebuild American credibility on the global stage. And I think that I'm very pleased to see that the president has taken a much tougher line on both China and Russia. And long-term, strategically, the way that we can combat it is to get things like the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership back up and running. That is a strategic counterweight that brings other countries into our economic orbit. And we know from history that when we bring countries into our economic orbit, and when we celebrate democracy, and when we live into our values, prosperity follows. And whenever we don't lean into our values, chaos and war follow, as exhibited with Saudi Arabia, and they killed an American journalist, and we let them get away with it. Now they're a major ally of the United States, but they're also causing a lot of disruption in Yemen and via a proxy war, and so like there's a lot for us to do on the foreign policy front to make sure that we continue the model that the United States built, building the world order around us, but we have to more consistently live and lean into our values, which is that democracy, not an economic order, but democracy where people get to choose their government, is really the best way to make sure that we're strengthening the global order. Herb, how do you say your name?
My apologies. If you're talking about, and your phrase was building the world order, and your emphasis is upon the value of promoting democracy as opposed to other considerations, what exactly do you have in mind that the United States should do or not do toward this end of building, I take it, a different world order?
Well, it's the world order that we built, but we haven't been consistent with it. So if you look at Germany and Japan post-World War II, those are really amazing success stories. If you look at Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., those are not success stories. And so like when we have invested in democracy genuinely, it's worked. And when we've sort of conflicted with our own values, we've seen a different outcome happen. Now, it's going to take a long time to be able to do that consistently. We don't need to change the world order tomorrow, but we do need to reinforce democratic values. We do need to hold the king of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince rather of Saudi Arabia, accountable whenever he murders an American journalist in cold blood, when he butchers him, allowing him to get away with that. Or like, I think the Biden administration is doing a fairly good job with like Israel and Palestine, for example, and walking that line of tension to say, hey, Israel, you can't just like steal people's land and murder people, but we are your ally, and we're reinforcing that we're your ally. And they're doing, I think the Biden administration is doing a good job of walking that line and bringing some accountability to bear to make sure that all sides of the situation are actually able to come out in a win scenario. David.
Yes, I see another chat question from Steve Calloway. What strategy or strategies will you use to appeal to rural areas that tend to be more conservative?
So there's a few. In Southwest Missouri, we're working on working with the Southwest Missouri Democrats, and there's a large Latino population that are eligible to vote for the very first time ever. So we're really working on building coalitions within that community to register new voters. It's an additive model. And the same thing in southeastern Missouri, towards the Boot Hill. There's a large African-American population that's been very much overlooked. And frankly, like both of those regions have been overlooked by Democrats for the last several cycles. And getting down there and having face time and recognition is extremely important to being able to win a race, and getting people excited to be able to participate in the democratic process and making them feel like their voices are being heard. So I've been in Poplar Bluff, I've been in South Central Missouri and Southwest Missouri a lot. And I'm continuing to do so, to rebuild coalitions that have seen a lot of atrophy happen over the last few cycles, by simply Democrats not investing there, not going there, not being present. Mr. Ellis, Kevin Ellis, is one of the Democratic chairs from Southeastern Missouri. He's also president of the AFGE Union, which is the Veteran Affairs Hospital in Poplar Bluff. He's bringing a lot of new energy to how they organize down there, and it's really exciting to see. I'm partnering with him, and that's two of the planks of the strategy. The other is we can't be afraid of religion. Like we as Democrats have let Republicans feel like they own religion in this country. I grew up here. I grew up Assembly of God, just like they did. I speak their language and I know their Bible because it's my Bible. And so whenever they start trying to use Bible verses to justify hatred or intolerance or a bad tax scheme that's going to end up hurting people, we just combat them like with the same language, and we give them permission to use their Bible to be liberal. Because if we actually read the text, one of the really exciting things to me about the New Testament, this is my Christian values coming out, is that it calls us to love our neighbor. And, you know, Democrats have those policies, Republicans don't. And so we have to lean into that. Carl.
Yeah. Hi, glad you could make it here, and I always appreciate folks coming on board here to give their views. There's always a huge tension between the federal government and state governments and local governments with respect to how they see things. I mean, it used to be that the states' rights were important to the conservatives, and and it seems like we keep getting leaned on local governments. And now with the state legislature even going so far as to suggest gun legislation nullification from federal authorities and so on. How do you see this argument panning out? Why is there this this question as to the question as to hypocrisy as to what local control is all about and what federal control is all about? Where do you see yourself on this issue?
It's not hypocrisy, it's all about power. And so Democrats traditionally were really good, really good at being very explicit about reaching out to marginalized groups of people. You know, it could be LGBTQ people, it could be Black people, it could be women, it could be Latin people. And there's a group that we miss, and that is working class white people. We never explicitly talk to working class white people. That's why Trump won, because he made them feel heard. And because the systems in this country, they've perceived as broken, not working for them. Because their infrastructure is crumbling, because they don't have access to healthcare, because they don't have access to education. And so the way that we begin to hold them accountable is to stop letting Republicans peel away those voters who don't feel represented and heard. Because we as Democrats have been really explicit about calling out every single other group, but one really important group in our coalition has not felt heard. And that has allowed Republicans to consolidate power and lean into autocracy. And so we need to make sure, in order to prevent a slide into autocracy, we need to start being explicit about talking to those people and making them feel like they're a part of the process, because they've been hurt, they've been exploited, and they've been oppressed just like all the other groups have, and they don't feel like we're talking to them. And so in order to begin to win them over, we can't just say, you hypocrite. We have to talk to their pain, and we have to say, yeah, like in the 8th congressional district, where the median income, not average, for a household is $22,000. Yeah, you feel pain. You're not surviving. You can't afford to pay bills. You can't afford to shop at a local mom and pop restaurant. And that the system that has been predominant in the United States has failed you, and we need to fix it. And so I see a major difference between the rank and file voters who are buying a message that Republicans are selling them. It's simply because Republicans are talking to them and we're not.
To kind of change gears here, you mentioned some software that you're working on to help with voter registration, I believe. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I met somebody through the Victory Institute, which supports LGBT. It's a PAC that supports LGBTQ candidates. And he has been working on a lot of, his name is Enrique Davis. He wrote a book about grassroots organizing. His firm, 365 Grassroots, I believe, I will get back to you on the proper noun for that, is building out software. And what they've done is they've taken every single precinct in the state, and they've loaded up like a visual view where you can tap on the precinct and you can see how many voters are in that precinct. And so we know that we need 144 more votes per precinct on average statewide in order to be able to win the election in the midterm. And so what's really great about that is whenever we equip field organizers and Democratic clubs and Democratic committees all across this state and other organizations that are involved in registering people to vote, when we equip them with that data, that allows them to say, wow, this precinct has 1,000 Democratic leaning people. We're going to go over there and we're going to register as many voters as possible. It also allows us to view density. And so it really helps our field organization and by extension, all of the field organizations to be able to make sure that we're registering as many new Democrats as possible. And the other part of the strategy is really in trying to make sure the Republicans don't have a candidate that excites their base. We don't want them to be excited to get out and vote, because if they are, they'll beat us. Doesn't matter who the candidate is. And so we need the most exciting candidate possible, and we need them to have the least exciting candidate possible so that we can get this state to flip in 2022. David.
Tim, yeah, I see another chat question from Wynn Caldwell. Says, do you think that not having served in an elected body before is a disadvantage to your candidacy? And how do you plan to overcome that?
No, I don't. I think that my record speaks for itself in terms of learning how politics works and moving levers. I had a multinational Wall Street firm attempt to fire me for standing up against for-profit prisons. And that multinational Wall Street firm did not fire me, and they no longer trade for-profit prisons at all in their portfolio. Second, I leveraged that multinational Wall Street firm to move the legislative process in Tennessee. And so I've learned a thing or two about how the bacon gets made, so to speak, and how to offer people and how to wheel and deal and how to make change happen. And I'm very excited to be able to do so in the United States Senate. Herb.
I'd like to go back to your previous answer. Before I do that, I want to thank you very much for including us in your road tour. We have, even though you're doing it from home, we appreciate it very much that you came before us. You said that you implied in your preceding statement that we needed not just somebody who would make a good senator, but the most exciting possible Senate candidate. Why are you the most exciting possible Senate candidate?
Few reasons. I have put a lot on the line in my career as an activist. I've actually risked my livelihood and well-being in order to do what's right. And it's always the right time to do what's right. That's number one. Number two, I'm the first LGBTQ candidate in the state's history who is openly out. That symbolism matters. It's not about whether or not I'm LGBTQ or not, but the term Missouri Uncompromised and everything that it means. And if you look at pictures of my family, you'll get a bigger picture of what I'm talking about. It is like a lightning bolt for Missouri to even be contemplating such a thing. It's exciting. It will make national headlines if you guys help me do this. It will help the country, and it will help Missourians lean into the fact that we are not backwoods, flyover country that don't value our neighbors, but that we do in fact celebrate the diversity that is the strength of the United States of America. And I think symbols matter. Being a United States senator, it's not just me, the human being, it's a symbol. We're sending a symbol to Washington. And I think that's a lot of what makes me an interesting candidate versus some of the others.
We have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. What else have we got? I'm looking. Other questions?
It's actually not a question so much as, I'm not sure you realize that Carl Scala is on our city council. And so when we talked about the East Campus neighborhood, we got a large group out on Monday night to city council meeting to say, hey, our neighborhood with its diversity is important. We also have another issue that the other issue that's coming before city council is it's called the Gans Creek Wild Area. It's part of Rockbridge State Park. And there is a developer that wants to take 65 acres and put at this point anyway, his plan is to put 113 houses on it. And it's virtually within yelling distance, and I think maybe only a pipeline right away from the undeveloped area of Rockbridge State Park, which is actually declared a wild area. So one of the great positive things that's happening locally is local people are getting excited about local issues and trying to get out and make it have an impact. And I think that's part of what you're saying statewide. And that's why I was just trying to fill you in a little bit.
Well, thank you. And yeah, everyone, we have to participate in our democracy. Like if we are our own self-government, and the government isn't like, I think we all know this as Democrats, but it's not some monolith entity separate from us. And I'm so excited that you guys are all involved in everything from your local government to all the way through state government to the federal government. We are the people who hold our elected leaders accountable. And I like to say often with my family, if we can't figure out how to have the debate across the kitchen table with each other, then how do we expect them to have the debate in Washington?
Yeah. Well, I also would add, we just elected our first African-American for Central Missouri for the state Senate.
That's fantastic. What's his name?
It's David Tyson Smith. And he too he's a lawyer. Are you an attorney?
No, I had to drop out of school because I got $60,000 in student loans, and I thought that was enough for me, and I just started working. That's another issue I should point out. On the Department of Education, I think we need to invest in making sure that everything from pre-K to after-school programs at the K through 12 level through community colleges, those should be accessible to people who are achieving the right, like a C or higher. We need to make all of the public land grant universities accessible if you're receiving good grades, if you're a C or higher. And then whenever we look at PhD programs, etc., we can figure out what's of strategic interest to the United States and make sure that we're investing in making sure that people are able to achieve high levels of education without having to graduate with a lot of debt. And that includes people like teachers. And then we also need to invest heavily in making job readiness training and vocational training a major pillar of the American education system again, because we have a lot of infrastructure to rebuild and a lot of infrastructure to build, and it's going to take a lot of steel workers and plumbers and electricians in order to do it. And there's a huge shortage of that because we have so heavily emphasized four-year education is the only way to be able to make a living in this country. That's valid. It's a great way. We need to invest in that, but we also need to make sure that we're investing in blue collar, in the trades, and strengthening our working people. Thank you, David Robinson. Appreciate it.
Just about out of time. We have one more, maybe two more questions for Tim. I'm looking for.
I would just, it's more, not more of a statement. I would just appreciate the fact that you're bringing up a variety of issues in your campaign. And I think that's important. It's important not just for you, but it's important to stress that for our party. And thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's getting back to that prior question about what makes me a different kind of candidate. I'm not consultanted to death, and I'm not just trying to talk out my declared talking points. I know that's how a lot of things happen, but I think that people want, and the thesis that drives my campaign is a citizen-led democracy. And that means an actual Missouri citizen being representative of the people and coming and talking to all of you and making sure that we're addressing all of the local issues and not just the issues that I want to talk about. So thank you all for your questions. And let's make sure that we represent every corner of this state. Let's beat the CAFOs. Let's talk about education. Let's reinforce democracy. Let's prevent autocracy. And let's make sure that we invest heavily and continue to lead the world in prosperity, and that we continue to build a counterweight against China. They are usurping our power. We have let them. We have to stop it. Let's go.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Tim. I want to, Tim, I think you're planning on being with us at the picnic in a couple of weeks. I thought so. I'm really excited about the picnic because usually we have a chili supper every year as a big fundraiser, and that's held. I think I've only made it to one of them. I'm fairly new at this, but I'm really excited because the pandemic has slid it. Now we're doing an outdoor picnic, and where we're having it is pretty well out my back door. So I was like, yeah, I can almost walk to it. I can almost see the pavilion from here. So I'm really excited about that. So if you all haven't already turned in your tickets or signed up to be there, please do, so you can meet Tim in person and our other candidates. I appreciate it. Kathy or Alice, can you remind us of who next week's speaker is before we leave?
Go ahead, Alice.
I know, it's Mike Trapp.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah, Pam mentioned it earlier, so thank you. Mike Trapp is one of our former city councilmen. He will be speaking. So come on back next week, everyone. Tim, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Tim.
Everybody, it's such
Look
a
forward to meeting in person in a couple of weeks. All right, everyone. I think our time is about up for today. So look forward to seeing everyone next week. Thank you so much. And thanks again to Tim, our guest speaker. I think I'll go ahead and slip out. I've got to head over to the local Democratic office. See you, everyone.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. Stay safe. Bye-bye.